It is certainly a blessing to be able to gather together like this and sing those songs. I look forward to that blessed land where we're going by and by. And when I look at what is happening to our world, I'm thinking, my goodness, there's got to be something better than this. And isn't it good in the midst of all this turmoil to be able to have that hope? And there's a lot of other things that we should hope for too. One of the themes that we'll get out of the lesson this morning is about how we need to trust God. And all these things going on in the world, they're things that you think, well, that'll never be, and we see them just giving way. And we can't trust things of this world. We need to trust God. And that's one of the main things, one of the main lessons that Isaiah is trying to getting across in Isaiah chapter 19 and 20. We've been looking through the book of Isaiah about once a month. I'll take a next little section of Isaiah, and we've been going through the nations round about Israel, and one by one it's been the burden of that nation. And the burden is a prophecy of hard times coming on that nation that surrounds Israel. This is a prophecy against Edom. It's a hard prophecy to deliver for Isaiah. You're going to see it just hurts him to have to say these things. So it's a burden. But this is the burden of Egypt. Now, in these, we've had a pattern developing here. I hope you've noticed it. God will talk about the punishment He's going to give to these nations. And then He holds out hope for something better to come. And those hopes are messianic hopes. And you're going to see that same pattern repeated here as we go through the burden of Egypt. So watch for that. Now, let's talk about Egypt just a little bit. Egypt was old civilization. The pyramids, there's a little saying that everything fears time, but time fears the pyramids. Well, it's just kind of a little poetic statement, but those pyramids had been there so long. In fact, they say, well, those pyramids would have been old when Abraham visited Egypt. And Egypt would have already been a substantial civilization by that time. We read about Abraham visiting in Egypt. Here's where Egypt is. If you're in your radio now on your car, I'm showing a picture of a map up here, all right? And that you see Egypt circled. And you see the Nile River going up to the delta there before it dips into the Mediterranean. Egypt has been called the gift of the Nile. That river coming out of the rainforest of South Africa or Southern Africa from Egypt and then going up, and it crosses the largest desert in the world, the Sahara Desert. This dust that we see, they say this comes from the Sahara dust. And it cuts right across that desert, the longest river in the world, crossing the largest desert in the world. And that river would flood seasonally, and those flood waters going out over that river bottom land and then receding back into the river is what gave that little strip of land its life. And it was abundance in production. Agriculture production is what gave Egypt the edge. And it was easy. You could produce great crops out of that delta with minimal effort. And so Egypt often became rich and complacent, prosperous and complacent. And so other dynasties would come and governments would fall and others return. But that's what gave Egypt its edge. There was a famine in the land of Canaan where Abraham was. And his name was Abram. This was earlier in his life, before it was changed to Abraham. And to escape that famine, Abram went to Egypt because of that Nile River. It would produce food for the Egyptians. Now, you know what happened? Abraham must have gotten over there and saw all the glories of this civilization in Egypt, and it seemed so far above what he was used to in Canaan. He lost his faith, and he became fearful. And he was afraid Pharaoh would want his wife. And he said, you just tell them you're my sister. That doesn't sound very nice, does it? And God intervened, or there would have been tragedy there. The result was Abraham came out of Egypt. He was very rich in silver and gold and much cattle coming out of Egypt. Well, we read later about Joseph. That was the son of Israel, his favorite son, the one he gave the coat of many colors to. And his brothers sold him as a slave into Egypt. And then from a slave he went into a prison. But Joseph was the interpreter of dreams. And he interpreted Pharaoh's dream about they would have 7 years of plenty and then 7 years of famine. And because of Joseph's wise administration, he became the second in command of all of Egypt, second only unto Pharaoh. And through his wise administration, Egypt was actually able to prosper through those years of famine by the peoples coming in and bringing all their riches to Egypt that they might have food that Egypt could produce for 7 years. Now, we talked about how Egypt, there's a series of dynasties in Egypt. And those pharaohs where Joseph brought his brothers into Egypt and they prospered in the land of Egypt, those pharaohs were replaced by another set of pharaohs. And they did not know Joseph. And they feared the Israelites. And so they made them serve with bitter and hard bondage. And God raised up Moses and said, you go to Egypt and tell Pharaoh, let my people go. And Pharaoh says, who is Jehovah, that I should obey his voice? I will not let them go. He had such a hard heart. And so that's where we read about those plagues on that chart. And after those plagues, the children of Israel left the land of Egypt through the wilderness on their way to Canaan. And in the Bible story, Egypt never prospered as it before those plagues. It never prospered so much after those plagues. It still remained a major player in world affairs, but it never had that power and glory that it had before those plagues. Now, the children of Israel, when they got out into the deserts and met those hardships, a lot of them wanted to go back into Egypt. And God did not want them trusting in Egypt. And we're going to see this became a problem throughout the history of Israel, their trust in Egypt. Now, if you'll see Egypt there, that other circle is the Tigris and Euphrates river valleys. And so there were two great empires, the Egyptian Empire and then the Assyrian Empire on those Tigris and Euphrates rivers. And if you look at the land of Israel in between, it's like a little land bridge between those two great civilizations. And they had the Mediterranean Sea on one side and the Arabian desert on the other side. And those civilizations would come in contact with each other through that land of Israel. Now, the burden of Egypt. You see, the Assyrians were on the rise. And the Israelites were frightened at what the Assyrians were doing to the nations. And many in Israel were again thinking, we'll trust Egypt. We'll make friends with Egypt. Now, they shouldn't have done this. They vacillated in their loyalties back and forth between those of the Tigris-Euphrates valleys and the Nile Valley, and it was bad for Israel. They should have trusted God. So God's going to give them, when they look, you can't trust Egypt. Let me tell you what's going to happen to Egypt. And that's where we have the burden of Egypt in Isaiah 19. It says, behold, the Lord rideth upon a swift cloud, and shall come into Egypt, and the idols of Egypt shall be moved at his presence, and the heart of Egypt shall melt in the midst of it. I want you to see God coming into Egypt like a storm coming in. And it's going to scare them. He says, I will set the Egyptians against the Egyptians, and they shall fight every one against his brother, and every one against his neighbor, city against city, and kingdom against kingdom. Civil turmoil in Egypt. One group fighting another, like a civil war going on. I mean, it almost sounds like us today, doesn't it? Look at all the turmoil going on in our society. And that's not a strong society when they're doing that. It's going to weaken them. And then the spirit of Egypt shall fail in the midst thereof. I'll destroy the counsel thereof, and they shall seek to the idols and to the charmers and to them that have familiar spirits and to the wizards. And the Egyptians will I give over into the hand of a cruel Lord. And a fierce king shall rule over them, saith the Lord of hosts. They're going to again look to all those idols and wizards, and they're looking to the wrong source for their help. And the Egyptians are going to be oppressed. This cruel Lord may have been the Egyptians oppressed by some of the Egyptians. It could refer to the Assyrians coming in to oppress them. But then on top of all that political turmoil, the Nile River would fail, and their crops would fail, and they wouldn't be able to catch their fish. Listen what happens. The waters shall fail from the sea, and the rivers shall be wasted and dried up. And they shall turn the rivers far away, and the brooks of defense shall be emptied and dried up. The reeds and flags shall wither. That's the vegetation going along that river. The paper reeds by the brooks, by the mouth of the brooks, and everything sown by the brooks shall wither, be driven away, and be no more. And the fishers also shall mourn. And they that cast angle into the brooks shall lament. And they that spread nets upon the waters shall languish. Moreover, they that work in fine flax, and they that weave network shall be confounded, and they shall be broken in the purpose thereof, all that make sluices and ponds for fish. So it's going to affect their vegetation, it's going to affect their crops, and it's going to affect the fishing industry that they have in Egypt. And they're going to be weakened because of their lack of food. And then this. You're not going to be able to think yourself out of this, Egypt. You're not going to be smart enough to figure out what to do to get out of this problem. The princes of Zon are fools. The counsels of wise counselors of Pharaoh is become brutish. How say you unto Pharaoh, I'm the son of the wise. I'm the son of an ancient king. Where are they? Where are thy wise men? And let me tell thee now, and let them know what the Lord of hosts hath purposed upon Egypt. The princes of Zon are become fools. The princes of Noph are deceived. They have also seduced Egypt, even they that are the stay of the tribes thereof. Okay, you got all these smart people in Egypt, think you can figure this one out? They're fools. Egypt, you're not going to think yourself out of this problem. And you're not going to be able to work yourself out of this problem. Isaiah 19:14. The Lord hath mingled a perverse spirit in the midst thereof, and they have caused Egypt to err in every work thereof, as a drunken man staggereth in his vomit. Neither shall there be any work for Egypt, which the head or tail or branch or rush may do. You won't think your way out of it. You won't work your way out of it. And they're going to become weak and fearful. In that day shall Egypt be like unto women, and it shall be afraid and fear because of the shaking of the hand of the Lord of hosts, which he shaketh over it. The land of Judah shall be a terror unto Egypt, and every one that maketh mention thereof shall be afraid in himself because of the counsel of the Lord of hosts, which he hath determined against it. You're not going to get anything out of Egypt. You don't need to put your trust in Egypt. They're going to have their own problems. But then a change takes place in this burden. And he talks about something to come that's much better. And Isaiah says, in that day shall 5 cities in the land of Egypt speak the language of Canaan. Now, the land of Canaan, that's the land of Israel. That's the land of God's people. They're going to start talking their language. It says, they'll swear unto the Lord of hosts, and one shall be called the city of destruction. In that day there shall be an altar to the Lord in the midst of the land of Egypt, and a pillar at the border thereof unto the Lord. They're going to build an altar in Egypt and start worshiping Jehovah. It says, and it shall be for a sign and for a witness unto the Lord of hosts in the land of Egypt, that they shall cry unto the Lord because of the oppressors, and he shall send them a Savior and a great one, and shall deliver them. And the Lord shall be known to Egypt, and the Egyptians shall know the Lord in that day, and shall do sacrifice and oblation. Yea, they shall vow a vow unto the Lord and shall perform it. They're going to turn to Jehovah. They're going to worship the God of Israel. They're going to worship the Lord. And the Lord shall smite Egypt. He shall smite and heal it. And they shall return every one to the Lord, and he shall be entreated of them and shall heal them. In that day there shall be a highway out of Egypt to Assyria, and the Assyrian shall come into Egypt, and the Egyptian into Assyria, and the Egyptians shall serve with the Assyrians. Now it doesn't say they'll serve the Assyrians, they'll serve with them. There's going to be a highway all the way from Egypt over to Syria. And they're going to be at peace with one another. They're going to be working together. In that day shall Israel be the third with Egypt and with Assyria, even a blessing in the midst of the land, whom the Lord of hosts shall bless, saying, here it is, blessed be Egypt, my people, and Assyria the work of my hands, and Israel my inheritance. Israel's afraid of the Assyrians. They hope they can get some relief from Egypt, but Egypt's going to have its own problems. But there's going to come a day all this warfare will cease. A highway all the way from Egypt to Syria. And the Lord blessing all the peoples together. Now when does this happen? Go back. Many lessons before, we studied in Isaiah chapter 11 that kind of introduced all this. Well, Isaiah said there would come a time when the wolf shall dwell with the lamb, and the leopard shall lie down with the kid, and the calf and the young lion and the fatling together. All these nations warring against one another, but the time will come. They're going to be in the same kingdom. In God's holy mountain, they're going to have peace with one another. And while I won't do it in this lesson, we know because of quotations in the New Testament, Isaiah is talking about the coming of the Lord's kingdom, the establishment of His church, all nations flowing into it. That kingdom would be spread about in all the world, and we would have peace together in God's kingdom, in God's church. Open your eyes, and you can see this fulfilled right today. Go look at the TV. Look at all the turmoil. Look what's going on. It's one race hating another race is what you see on TV. And then look at the Lord's church. Look what's going on. I tell you, we don't do that in the kingdom of heaven. Go worship with our brethren of any nation, of any race, of any color, of any culture. We come together and we love each other in God's kingdom. And we work together. And that's the difference in the kingdom of heaven and the kingdom of men. Now right quick, I want to go through Isaiah 20. You're going to get this signal. And this will be a sign to you. I want to impress this lesson on you about don't trust Egypt. Here's the sign. You're going to see the year that Tartan came up into Ashdod when Sargon, the king of Assyria, sent him and fought against Ashdod and took it. Now here's Ashdod right there. The Assyrians, that's what he's talking about. They're going to come, and when they take Ashdod, this Egyptian stronghold, then you'll know that this trouble is going to come on Egypt. And I don't want you to forget this. You've talked about illustrating a sermon. Look what God told Isaiah to do. At the same time spake the Lord by Isaiah the son of Amoz, said, Go and loose the sackcloth from off thy loins, and put off thy shoe from thy foot. And he did so, walking naked and barefoot. And the Lord said, Like as my servant Isaiah hath walked naked and barefoot 3 years for a sign and a wonder upon Egypt and upon Ethiopia, so shall the king of Assyria lead away the Egyptians prisoners and the Ethiopians captives, young and old, naked and barefoot, even with their buttocks uncovered, to the shame of Egypt. Isaiah, take those garments off. If you're wearing clothes, that naked doesn't mean absolutely naked. It can mean poorly clothed. You dress like a slave being led away into captivity. And for 3 years, that'll be your clothing. Now I like good sermon illustrations, but I'm not going to illustrate that, okay? Don't expect me to do that. But that's what Isaiah was to do, to impress upon Israel the certainty of this burden which he spake unto them. And then it says in the last verse, They shall be afraid and ashamed of Ethiopia, their expectation, and of Egypt their glory. And the inhabitants of this isle shall say in that day, Behold, such is our expectation, whether we flee for help to be delivered from the king of Assyria, and how shall we escape? What are we going to do? We can't count on Egypt. The Assyrians are coming. What are we going to do? How do we escape? And that's where this comes to the end. Okay, here's the lessons to learn. One, we got to trust God. I tell you, we put our trust in earthly things, and earthly things fail. But we need to trust God who never fails. Number two, great nations can fall. Egypt did, Assyria did. All these nations we read about, they're no more. They fall. And if the world lasts, America will fall. All other nations have. I hope it doesn't fall in my lifetime. I didn't ever think it would. I'm wondering now, aren't you? But great nations will fall. The wisdom of man is foolishness with God. Remember when the Egyptians said, Well, we'll talk to our wise men. They'll help us through this. Isaiah 9:12, where are they? Where are thy wise men? And let them tell thee now, and let them know what the Lord of hosts hath purposed upon Egypt. Those wise men weren't going to help the Egyptians out of this. And those words are used by the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 1:20. When Paul says, Where is the wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the disputer of this world? Hath not God made foolish the wisdom of this world? Man's not going to be able to figure all this out. I tell you, we've got to trust God and see what He has revealed to us. It's God's plan, and it's not man's. We can't outthink God on these things. And then this last lesson, and that is God had a plan for all nations. We've seen it repeatedly in these burdens from Isaiah. God's got a plan for something better, where we can come together as one and dwell together in peace. And those in the world that are at enmity one with another, if they would hear and believe and obey the gospel of Christ, can come together in His kingdom and be God's people, so that we're no more enemies and strangers but fellow citizens and of the household of God. Isn't that a great comfort to know in these troubled times? And so I extend that invitation. Don't stay out in a world of turmoil. Come into the kingdom of peace, into the kingdom of God. Be one of His people. If you're ready to do that this morning, then let that be known by coming forward as we stand and sing the invitation song.